Kia ora team, Chris Farhi here. In today's vlog, figured I'd take some time to talk about one of the topics that I'm really passionate about, which is corporate real estate. So how do organisations use space? How do they make decisions about their real estate? There's been some pretty interesting announcements over the last week or two, so I figured it'd be a really cool opportunity to talk about my passion in that sort of context. Before I start, if you're also really passionate about corporate real estate, then we've got the big event of the year coming up shortly. So that's the CoreNet Symposium happening at the end of May. I'm one of the volunteers that's helping to make it happen. Super excited about it. Really cool lineup of speakers, both domestic and international. So if you think that looks cool, then hit it up online, get some tickets. I'll pop a link in the description. Before you do that though, quickly smash that like button and we'll get into it. So we'll start off with the big picture with my mates in the Colliers Research team who released their latest Auckland CBD Office report. The big finding in this report was that the Auckland CBD Office vacancy rate, so how much space is available for lease, has increased from 4.7 to 8.8%. So a reasonably big jump over the last 12 months. They've put that down to two main causes. One is COVID-19 and the sort of remote working trends and the impact of COVID-19 generally. And on top of that, there's been a really big injection of new office space into the market. Despite the increase in vacancies, the Colliers Research team indicated that net face rents across the market have been largely stable. Now I know the boffins out there, you're going to be saying, oh, what about the net effective rents? So this is the face rent after adjusting for any kickbacks, so like incentives, rent-free periods and that type of thing. They didn't directly comment on that. In terms of my own observations, so what I'd say is that there's a bit of a two-speed market at the moment. So for landlords that have actual vacant space, they're tending to be a little bit more aggressive around incentives. So trying to maintain the face rent as high as possible because that helps their valuation of the building, but maybe boosting their incentives to secure deals. Meanwhile, if you've got landlords that have sitting tenants and have maybe been quite insulated from the impact of COVID and all of that so far, they tend to be a lot more bullish and kind of less helpful when it comes to rents, incentives and that type of thing. What that says to me is that corporate occupiers have to be much more sensitive about how they go about negotiating with their landlords, looking at things like relocations, renewals and that type of thing in order to get the best deal. The research also noted a couple of larger transactions. So tech company NTT is going to be moving from the viaduct down to 155 Fanshawe Street. So that's the new campus building on the edge of Wynyard Quarter. And then on top of that, Tower Insurance is going to be moving from the bottom of Queen Street over to 136 Fanshawe Street, which I guess is kind of on the edge of Victoria Quarter, almost like Wynyard Quarter, but that's one of the other new buildings that's just being finished off by Manson's. So in terms of announcements from other occupiers, Sky Television also made an announcement on the NZX saying that they were preparing to sell 2 of the 3 properties at their Mt Wellington headquarters. So this one's quite interesting because the announcement talked about how over the past year the way that their staff work has changed, so they're kind of working more flexibly between home and the office, and as a result it's basically freed up space for them to look at freeing up some capital that's currently held within their properties and reinvesting it elsewhere. So that one's pretty exciting. The announcement also said that Colliers had been appointed to market the sites, so I assume that you'll start to see some advertising for those soon. On the topic of remote working, there are also a couple of global announcements made in the last week or two with Amazon, Google and JP Morgan all in the headlines. Talking to people around the market over the last week or so, there's been a lot of interest in the announcements, but I think there's a lot of context that needs to be put in place before you kind of think about them too hard. So with New Zealand, we've obviously tracked through the pandemic quite nicely. Generally speaking, our lockdowns have been quite short relative to overseas. Whereas if you go overseas right now, a lot of companies have been working remotely since the start of the pandemic. And so these announcements, along with making observations about remote work, they're also more in the context of like transitioning people back to work rather than firm directions on how they might operate permanently. You know, in a lot of cases, the clickbait headlines didn't help either because they made the announcement seem quite black and white, but in actual fact, they're quite grey in a lot of cases. So jumping into each of the announcements, we'll start with Google. So what they announced is that their offices will be broadly reopening in September, and at that stage they'll be looking for staff to be in the office at least 3 days a week. Now this one's kind of interesting because if you looked at some of the headlines, they sensed a little bit more kind of urgency in there. So New Zealand Herald said Google urges its staff to return to the office. But if you actually look at the bits of the announcement that were leaked, not that kind of massive, and it was more just, hey, we're looking to reopen our offices in September. So it was more of a sort of general announcement rather than any firm position on remote working. So moving over to Amazon, their announcement was made publicly on their website. So it was entitled Amazon Updates Return to Office Guidance. And basically what they've said in that is that their offices will start to open over the coming period. They sort of referred to them in seasons, which wasn't that helpful, but that they're expecting a return to an office-centric culture. So this one was interesting as well, because a lot of the headlines were saying, oh, Amazon tells staff to return to the office, but basically what this one was doing is just giving staff an update relative to prior announcements, which said that they would be working from home until June. And so it was just, hey, we're looking to reopen the office, and it sort of flagged the return to the office-centric culture, but it didn't really specify anything beyond that. So of the three announcements, the JP Morgan one was probably the most interesting because it had a little bit more depth beyond a couple of words. And so the context for this was, it was within the annual letter to shareholders that the CEO kind of fires off to everyone. And within it, there was a section entitled The Pandemic Accelerated Remote Working Capabilities, which will likely carry forward. So JP Morgan's one of the big global financial services companies. Within the letter, basically he said that they were looking to move to, like, I guess a hybrid sort of way of doing things with three sort of key areas. So staff that are in on-site jobs or like critical operations jobs, so it's like retail bank branches, operations staff, vaults and that sort of stuff. So they'll remain on-site full-time. For other workers, they might have more of a mix, so they might be in the office some of the time and then at home some of the time. And then for a small proportion of staff, which he flagged at maybe 10%, they might go fully remote work, like permanently. So in summing that up, he said that it will change how they look at their real estate. He said that they'll quickly move to a more open seating arrangement, which I assume is like open plan, with digital tools to manage seating arrangements, which also indicates probably like flexible desk sharing. Within the letter, he also talked about some of the weaknesses that they'd observed from remote working, and I think these are really interesting. So what's he say here? He says, some of the weaknesses include performing jobs remotely is more successful when people know each other, but less successful when they don't know each other, which I think is definitely true. A lot of professionals learn through apprenticeship models, and that definitely doesn't work that well through remote means. Heavy reliance on Zoom meetings slows down decision making, and then finally, remote work virtually eliminates spontaneous learning and creativity because you don't run into people around the coffee machine and that sort of thing. So those observations are pretty interesting, a lot of common sense to be fair. The thing that it brings to mind for me is, how does remote working work relative to the competitive edge for your business? So if things like creativity and innovation are quite important, then does remote working start to stymie that? Or is it better to balance that off with the cost efficiencies and the well-being improvements for staff? So in terms of what can we learn from these announcements relative to New Zealand, I think it's interesting. The first is that the clickbait headlines often are way too black and white as to what these companies are announcing. The second is that the announcements are typically like in a different context, because they're typically firms that are like transitioning back to the office, whereas New Zealand's already been operating in that way for like most of the pandemic. And then finally, someone who's donkey deep in this stuff said to me last week that it's way too early to form a definitive view on the impact of remote working on corporate real estate, and I think that's a completely fair comment. I think in a lot of ways organisations are in like a pilot testing phase at the moment, where it will take probably a year or two to figure out how remote working works best, and it will just continue to evolve over time. My big hope as like a corporate real estate person is that people don't rush into decisions, because corporate real estate is really expensive and often it has really long-term decisions in play, and so it's not something that you really want to rush into. So that wraps us up for today. As you can see, I find this stuff really interesting. If you do too, two things. So have a look at that CoreNet Symposium, and also jump on LinkedIn and check out the Week in Corporate Real Estate, which I publish every week or two on that platform. Drop us a like on this video, and we'll see you next time. Cheers, bye.